vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean holds secrets that refuse to stay buried beneath the waves. It is a watery graveyard where silence reigns supreme, and the horizon stretches into an eternal void of blue. In the summer of 1937, the world waited with bated breath for news of a silver bird lost in the clouds. Amelia Mary Earhart had vanished into the ether, leaving behind only static and questions that haunt historians to this day. The ocean does not give up its dead easily, but sometimes it whispers their stories to those willing to listen in the dead of night. This is not just a tale of a crash, but of the terror that followed in the silence. Imagine sitting alone in a dimly lit room in St. Petersburg, Florida, during a humid July evening. 15-year-old Betty Clink pressed her ear against the fabric speaker of her family radio console. The airwaves were usually filled with music or news broadcasts, but that night she heard something that made her blood run cold. Through the crackle of atmospheric interference, a frantic female voice cried out for help. The woman spoke of rising water and an injured man. Betty grabbed a notebook and began to scribble down the terrifying plea. She was listening to a ghost before the body had even died. Betty was not the only one who heard the desperate cries echoing through the ionosphere that week. Across the United States and Canada, dozens of ordinary citizens reported hearing similar transmissions. They described a woman whose voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. She called out coordinates that did not make sense to the layperson, but signaled distress to those who knew aviation. The authorities dismissed many of these reports as hoaxes or misunderstandings. Yet the consistency of the details suggests a darker truth. The Aviator was alive, and she was screaming into the void, hoping someone would answer. To understand the horror of those final days, we must look back at the ambition that led to the tragedy. Amelia Mary Earhart was the darling of the aviation world and a symbol of boundless courage. She sought to become the first woman to circumnavigate the globe around the equator. Her aircraft was a Lockheed Electra 10E, which was a state-of-the-art twin-engine monoplane. It was a silver machine that represented the pinnacle of human engineering. However, even the finest machine is no match for the indifferent cruelty of nature. The Pacific flight was the most dangerous leg of her journey. Beside her, in the cockpit, sat Frederick Joseph Noonan. He was a seasoned navigator with a reputation for precision and a fondness for alcohol that worried some of their backers. Frederick Joseph Noonan was the eyes that would guide them across the trackless ocean. He relied on the stars and the sun to chart their course using a bubble sextant. The pressure on both of them was immense as the entire world watched their progress. They were two tiny specks of life in a metal shell, suspended above thousands of miles of unforgiving water. They departed from Lee, New Guinea on July 2nd, 1937. The runway was short, and the plane was heavy with fuel for the long haul to Howland Island. Observers noted that the aircraft struggled to lift off and barely cleared the waves at the end of the airstrip. It was a foreshadowing of the struggle that lay ahead. As they climbed into the sky, the lush green jungle faded away, replaced by the endless monotony of the ocean. They were flying into a trap set by bad weather and communication failures. The destination was Howland Island, which is a tiny sliver of land in the middle of nowhere. It is barely a mile long and almost invisible from the air, even in perfect conditions. The United States Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed there to guide them in with radio signals. However, the radio equipment on the Electra and the Itasca were incompatible in frequency capabilities. It was a fatal oversight that would seal their doom. As they approached the vicinity of the island, the clouds thickened and the sun vanished. On board the Itasca, the radio operators waited tensely for a signal. They heard Amelia Earhart reporting that gas was running low. Her voice was taut with rising panic. She stated they were flying north and south along the line of position. She could not see the island, and she could not hear the Itasca. The operators on the ship frantically tried to respond, but their messages went unheard. The invisible thread connecting the plane to safety had snapped. The Silver Bird was alone in the gray mist. The standard historical narrative suggests that the Electra ran out of fuel and crashed into the deep ocean, killing both aviators instantly. This is the clean and sanitary version of events. It is the version that allows us to believe they did not suffer. However, evidence discovered years later points to a far more gruesome conclusion. Instead of crashing, they may have found a reef surrounding a desolate atoll called Gardner Island, which is now known as Nicumararo. It was a place of jagged coral and blistering heat. Imagine the scene as the fuel gauges dropped to empty. The engines sputtered and died one by one. Amelia Earhart would have had to glide the heavy aircraft toward the white line of breaking waves she spotted in the distance. With immense skill, she set the plane down on the flat coral reef, exposed at low tide. The landing gear held, and the plane came to a shuddering halt. They were alive, but they had landed in a hellscape from which there was no escape. Gardner Island is a place of harsh beauty and deadly conditions. There is no fresh water source. On the island, only sporadic rainfall. The sun beats down with relentless intensity, turning the coral rock into a frying pan. The vegetation is dense and tangled, making movement difficult. But the true horror of the island reveals itself when the sun goes down. The darkness brings out creatures that seem born of a nightmare. The island is infested with coconut crabs, which are massive crustaceans that can smell blood from miles away. For the first few days, the plane sat on the reef. At low tide, they could run the right engine to charge the radio batteries. This explains the distress calls heard by Betty Clank and others. They could only transmit when the tide was out, and the water was not shorting the electrical system. They were sending messages into the night, praying for salvation. They mentioned the rising water and the shifting plane. They knew their lifeline was precarious. The ocean was slowly reclaiming their only shelter. Inside the cramping fuselage, the temperature would have been unbearable. Frederick Joseph Noonan had reportedly injured his head during the rough landing. Without medical attention, in the tropical heat, infection would have set in rapidly. Amelia Mary Earhart watched her companion deteriorate while fighting her own thirst and hunger. The psychological toll of hearing static in response to her pleas must have been shattering. She was the most famous woman in the world, yet she was utterly alone. The radio signals continued for several nights until the tides finally won. The waves eventually pushed the Electra off the edge of the reef and into the deep water. With the plane gone, the radio went silent forever. Now they were castaways on the dry land, with no way to call for help. They established a makeshift camp under the shade of a wren tree. They scavenged for clams and collected rainwater in small, improvised containers. It was a primitive existence for a woman accustomed to the heights of celebrity. The thirst would have been the first true torture. Dehydration causes the mind to unravel. Hallucinations begin to blur the line between reality and nightmare. Amelia Mary Earhart likely saw ships on the horizon that were not there. She likely heard voices in the wind. As her body weakened, her will to survive was tested against the brutal indifference of the environment. She was a pioneer of the skies, now reduced to crawling on the sharp coral of a deserted rock. Then there were the crabs. Coconut crabs can grow up to 3 feet wide and possess claws powerful enough to crack coconuts open. They are scavengers that swarm over anything organic. At night, the sound of their clattering legs on the coral would have been deafening. As Frederick Joseph Noonan succumbed to his injuries and passed away, the horror would have intensified. Amelia Mary Earhart would have been forced to witness nature taking its course in the most grotesque way imaginable. We know they were there because of what they left behind. 3 years later, in 1940, a British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher arrived on Gardner Island to establish a settlement. He found a campsite that looked unlike anything a Polynesian fisherman would build. He found the remains of a shoe that matched the style Amelia Mary Earhart wore. He found a sextant box similar to the one Frederick Joseph Noonan used. And most chillingly, he found a partial human skeleton. The bones were scattered near the base of a tree, as if pulled apart by scavengers. There was a skull and several long bones. Gerald Gallagher suspected he had solved the mystery of the missing Aviator. He packed the remains in a box made for Kanawha wood and shipped them to Fiji for analysis. He believed he held the mortal remains of the lost queen of the air. The discovery was kept quiet as the world was consumed by the fires of the Second World War. In Fiji, a doctor named David Hoodless examined the bones. His analysis was a tragedy of errors, working with limited reference materials and antiquated methods. He concluded the bones belonged to a stocky male of European or Polynesian descent. He dismissed the idea that they could be Amelia Mary Earhart. The bones were then stored in a vault and eventually lost to time. They were discarded as mere curiosities rather than treated as historical evidence. Decades later, modern forensic anthropologists re-examined the measurements Dr. Hoodless had recorded using computerized databases that did not exist in the 1940s. They came to a startlingly different conclusion. The measurements were a near-perfect match for a tall female of European descent. The bone length corresponded to the height and build of Amelia Mary Earhart. The science suggests that the British officer had indeed found her, but the bureaucracy of the time failed to recognize the truth. Expeditions to Nicumararo in recent years have uncovered more artifacts that paint a picture of a desperate survival attempt. They found fragments of a pocket knife, identical to one listed in the inventory of the Electra. They found a piece of rouge makeup from the 1930s. They found a broken jar of freckle cream. Amelia Mary Earhart was known to dislike her freckles and carried such cream with her. These intimate personal items are the ghostly footprints of a woman trying to maintain her identity in the face of oblivion. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence is a small piece of aluminum sheet found on the island. The rivet pattern on the metal matches the specific repair work done on the Electra just before it left Miami. It was a custom patch used to replace a navigator window. This debris confirms that the plane was there. It broke apart in the surf, and pieces washed ashore, while the main fuselage sank into the abyss. The physical proof of the tragedy has been resting there for decades. The final days of Amelia Mary Earhart were not filled with the glory of flight, but with the grit of survival. She was a castaway on a speck of land forgotten by time. She likely died of dehydration or exposure alone under the strange stars of the southern hemisphere. The image of the courageous aviator perishing in such a hopeless manner is far more haunting than a quick death in a plane crash. It is a slow fade into the darkness. The island of Nicumararo retains a sinister atmosphere to this day. Visitors report a feeling of being watched from the dense brush. The heat is oppressive, and the silence is heavy. It is as if the island itself remembers the tragedy. The coconut crabs still scuttle over the coral in the moonlight, searching for food. The wind still howls through the wren trees, carrying the phantom echoes of a radio distress call that no one could answer. There is a phenomenon known as residual haunting, where a traumatic event imprints itself on a location. The intense emotion and suffering act as a recording that plays over and over. Perhaps the distress signals heard by Betty Clink were not just radio waves, but a psychic projection of terror. The intensity of Amelia Mary Earhart wanting to be found was so strong it rippled across the world. She refused to disappear without a scream. The story of the lost aviator serves as a grim reminder of our fragility. We build machines to conquer nature, but nature always wins in the end. The Pacific Ocean is vast and indifferent to human ambition. It swallowed the most famous woman in the world and left only scraps for us to find. The mystery of her disappearance is not a riddle of navigation, but a tragedy of endurance. It is the story of a slow and lonely end. Some historians still cling to the crash and sink theory because it is less painful. It offers closure without suffering, but the evidence of the radio calls and the artifacts on the island demands we face the darker reality. We must acknowledge the fear she felt as the water rose. We must acknowledge the despair of watching the horizon for a rescue that never came. To ignore these details is to dishonor her struggle. The skeleton found by Gerald Gallagher is likely gone, forever lost in the chaos of history, but the measurements remain as a digital ghost. They tell us that a woman died on that island, a woman who wore size 9 shoes and carried freckle cream, a woman who looked at the stars and dared to fly closer to them than anyone else. The bones speak the truth that the world was too afraid to hear. As night falls over the Pacific, tonight the waves will crash against the reef of Nicumararo, just as they did in 1937. The crabs will emerge from their burrows. The silence will descend like a heavy blanket somewhere in the deep water off the reef. The wreckage of a silver plane lies entombing the dreams of an era. The pilot is gone, but the legend remains suspended in the amber of history. The mystery of Amelia Mary Earhart is not just an unsolved puzzle. It is a ghost story in the truest sense. It is a story of a spirit that could not rest. It is a story of signals reaching out from the grave. When you look up at the night sky and see the vast emptiness, remember the silver bird that fell. Remember the silence that followed. And remember that some riddles are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be felt. Even today, researchers continue to scour the ocean floor looking for the main fuselage. They use sonar and underwater drones, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Electra. Every expedition brings new hope and new disappointment. The ocean guards its prize with jealous possessiveness. It is as if the Pacific itself has claimed Amelia Mary Earhart as its own. She belongs to the deep now. The legacy of Amelia Mary Earhart is defined by her courage, but her end was defined by her humanity. She was not a goddess. She was a woman of flesh and blood who faced a terrible fate. The fear she must have felt is a universal human experience. It connects us to her across the decades. We are all flying blind in some way hoping to find land before the fuel runs out. The radio logs from the Itasca are a transcript of doom. They document the precise moments when hope turned to desperation. Reading them now is like reading a script for a tragedy that has already been performed. We know the ending, but we still hope for a different outcome. We want the radio to crackle with a confirmation of safety, but the static is the only answer. In the end, the story of Amelia Mary Earhart is a reminder that the world is still full of unknowns. Despite our satellites and our technology, there are places where people can vanish without a trace. There are mysteries that defy explanation. The Pacific Riddle is not just about where she went, but about what happened in those final, lonely hours. It is the ultimate cold case. So the next time you hear the crackle of static between radio stations, pause and listen closely. You might hear a voice from the past calling out coordinates. You might hear the plea of a lost soul drifting on the ether. The Aviator is still out there, flying her final course, waiting for a landing strip that will never appear. She is the ghost of the Pacific, and she is never coming home.